A successful businessman discovered that the old woman selling pies on the roadside had once saved his life. And what happened next destroyed everything he believed about success. Elijah Cobb had everything. A 5-bedroom house in Alpharetta, Georgia, a Mercedes he washed every Saturday, a construction company that employed 43 people and generated $6 million a year. He had a wife, Sharon, 2 sons, a golden retriever named King, and a church pew with his name on a brass plate because he had donated $50,000 to the building fund in 2016, and the church showed its gratitude in metal. But at 7:42 every morning for 361 days, Elijah Cobb drove past an old woman sitting behind a folding table on Lawrenceville Highway, selling sweet potato pies from a cooler. He saw her every day. She was always there. Same table, same cooler, same spot between the gas station and the tire shop. And for 361 days, Elijah Cobb did not stop. On the 362nd day, he stopped. And what he found at that table took the man who had everything and showed him the one thing he had lost. Welcome everyone to another story. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Florida, Lagos, maybe Trinidad or the United Kingdom? Let us know. Now pay attention to what happens next, because this is one of those stories where the answer was sitting on the side of the road the whole time, and the only thing keeping a man from seeing it was the speed at which he was driving. Elijah Cobb was 44 years old. He was built like the buildings he constructed, broad, solid, designed to take weight. He had dark skin, a shaved head, and hands that still had calluses even though he hadn't swung a hammer himself in 8 years, because Elijah believed that a man who forgets what labor feels like forgets who he is. He wore pressed khakis and collared shirts to job sites, not suits, never suits, because suits were for men who wanted to look like they worked, and khakis were for men who actually did. He had a scar on his right forearm from a nail gun accident in 2004, and he kept it uncovered because Sharon once said it reminded her that he was a man who built things with his body before he built them with his mind. And Elijah liked being reminded of that. He drove the same route every morning, Highway 29 to Lawrenceville Highway, left at the Shell station, straight past the tire shop, onto the job site in Snellville. He drove it at 7:35 a.m., which meant he passed the folding table at 7:42, give or take 30 seconds depending on the light at Scenic Highway. The old woman was always there by 7:42. She set up early. Elijah once noticed her unfolding the table at 6:50 when he had an early start, and she stayed until the afternoon, judging by the times Elijah drove back through at 3 or 4, and the table was still there, the cooler still open, the pies still stacked. He noticed her the way people notice things they drive past daily, with the peripheral, uncurious awareness that registers an object without engaging with it. She was part of the landscape, part of the commute, a detail between the gas station and the tire shop, as fixed and unexamined as the speed limit sign or the pothole near the median that he swerved around without thinking. He didn't know her name. He didn't know how old she was. He didn't know that the pies in that cooler were made from a recipe that was older than both of them combined, or that the woman behind the table had once held his face in her hands and told him he was going to be somebody. He didn't know because he hadn't stopped, and he hadn't stopped because stopping would mean slowing down. And Elijah Cobb had spent 30 years building a life on the principle that slowing down was how people like him got left behind. But what happened next changed everything. To understand why Elijah finally stopped, you have to understand why he was driving so fast in the first place. And that means going back to a place he didn't like to visit. Not the place on the map, but the place in his memory. Elijah grew up in the Bowen Homes housing project on the west side of Atlanta. He was the youngest of 4, 3 older sisters and him. His mother, Denise Cobb, was a home health aide who worked 12-hour shifts caring for elderly patients in Buckhead, which meant she spent her days in beautiful houses that belonged to other people, and her evenings in a 2-bedroom apartment that belonged to the city of Atlanta and smelled like the radiator fluid that leaked from the unit below. Denise was tough. Not mean tough. Structural tough. She held things up. She held the apartment, the children, the bills, the school forms, the doctor's appointments, the groceries, the laundry, the bedtime routines, all of it, alone, with no help except her mother, Dorothy, who was 72 and had bad hips and could watch the children but couldn't chase them, which meant Denise's evenings were a continuous negotiation between exhaustion and obligation. Elijah's father was not in the picture. His name was Gerald Cobb. He'd been in the picture briefly, long enough to produce 4 children and the conviction for armed robbery that sent him to Hayes State Prison in 1984 when Elijah was 3. Elijah didn't remember him. He had a photograph, one creased with a corner torn off, that showed a man with Elijah's jaw and Elijah's build standing in front of a car that didn't belong to him. That was all Elijah had of his father, a jaw, a build, and a photograph of a borrowed car. It was not enough to build a relationship on. It was barely enough to build a memory. Elijah was a difficult child. Not bad, difficult. He had energy that exceeded the apartment's capacity, a voice that exceeded the apartment's tolerance, and a curiosity that exceeded the apartment's ability to answer. He asked why the radiator leaked. He asked why the elevator smelled. He asked why the man on the 3rd floor was always angry and the woman on the 5th floor was always crying. He asked questions that had answers nobody wanted to give a 6-year-old, and when the answers didn't come, he filled the gaps with noise and motion, which the teachers at BES Bowen Elementary School interpreted as behavior problems and which resulted in 3 suspensions by the time he was in 3rd grade. And that is where the old woman comes in. Her name was Loretta Price. She was Elijah's 4th grade teacher at Bowen Elementary in the 1989-1990 school year. She was 46 years old then, which made her, if you're counting, 80 years old the year she was selling pies on Lawrenceville Highway while Elijah drove past at 7:42 every morning. Now, I need you to understand who Loretta Price was, because this woman is the reason Elijah Cobb is alive. And that is not a metaphor. That is a fact. Loretta Price was 5'4", with silver hair she wore in 2 puffs above her ears and glasses that sat on the tip of her nose so she could look over them when she wanted a child to know she was serious, which was often. She wore long skirts and flat shoes and a cardigan in every color except red because she said red was for fire engines and stop signs, and she was neither. She smelled like cocoa butter and chalk dust. 2 smells that should not go together but that, in the specific alchemy of Loretta Price's classroom, became the scent of safety. She'd been teaching for 22 years by the time Elijah walked into her classroom. 22 years of underfunded schools, of textbooks held together with packing tape, of desks carved with initials from students she'd outlasted. 22 years in rooms where the heat didn't always work and the windows didn't always close, and the ceiling tiles were stained with water damage that the district kept scheduling for repair and never repaired. Loretta taught in those rooms the way a conductor conducts an orchestra in a barn, with total commitment to the music and total disregard for the venue. Elijah arrived in her classroom with a file. The file said, "Behavioral issues, suspensions, poor attention span, possible learning disability." Loretta read the file. She closed it. She put it in her desk drawer and never opened it again. She told Elijah on his first day, "I don't read files. I read children, and I'm going to read you. So sit up straight and let me see your face." Elijah sat up straight. Nobody had ever asked to see his face. People looked past him. People looked at his behavior report. People looked at the suspensions. Loretta looked at his face, and what she saw was not a problem child, but a child with a problem. Specifically, a child whose brain moved faster than his environment could accommodate, and whose body compensated with motion because motion was the only output available. But what Loretta didn't know yet was that Elijah was also hungry. Not metaphorically, actually hungry. Denise worked 12-hour shifts. She left the apartment at 5:30 a.m. and returned at 7 p.m. Dorothy fed the children in the evenings, but Dorothy's hips made standing at a stove painful, so dinner was often cereal or toast, or whatever could be assembled without sustained standing. Breakfast was whatever was in the cabinet, which by the end of the month was often nothing. Elijah came to school hungry 3 or 4 mornings a month, and on those mornings his behavior was at its worst, because hunger makes children fast and loud the way caffeine makes adults fast and loud. It's fuel burning wrong, energy with no direction, the body screaming for something the mind can't name. Loretta figured it out in October. She figured it out because she had been teaching hungry children for 22 years, and she knew the signs. The distraction at 10 a.m., the irritability before lunch, the way a child's eyes follow a classmate's sandwich across the cafeteria, the way a compass follows north. She didn't say anything to Elijah. She didn't call Denise. She didn't file a report. She started bringing an extra breakfast to school every morning. A biscuit, a piece of fruit, a carton of juice, and she left it on Elijah's desk before he arrived, wrapped in a napkin, with no note, no explanation, no fanfare. Just food, every morning, for the entire year. And that was only the beginning. Elijah ate the biscuit, and his behavior changed. Not magically, the file didn't disappear and the suspensions didn't evaporate, but the 10 a.m. crashes stopped. The pre-lunch irritability dimmed. He was still energetic, he was still loud, he was still the kid who asked why the radiator leaked and why the elevator smelled, and why the man on the 3rd floor was always angry. But now the energy had a floor underneath it. It had fuel. And Loretta redirected it the way a river is redirected, not by blocking it, but by digging a new channel. She put him in charge of the classroom library, 12 books donated, most of them missing covers. Elijah organized them by size, then by color, then by subject, and when he ran out of systems, Loretta taught him the Dewey Decimal System, which was absurdly advanced for a 4th grader, and exactly the kind of structured complexity that Elijah's brain had been starving for. He memorized it in 3 days. He labeled each book with a number written on masking tape. He kept a checkout log in a notebook. He was 9 years old and running a library. And for the first time in his life, the energy that adults had been calling a problem was being called a skill. But what Loretta did next, what she did that nobody at Bowen Elementary knew about, is the thing that saved Elijah's life. In February 1990, Elijah was suspended for the 4th time. He had gotten into a fight with a boy named Travis, who had called Elijah's mother a name that 9-year-olds should not know, and that Travis had learned from the man on the 3rd floor who was always angry. Elijah hit Travis. Travis hit back. A teacher separated them. The principal, a man named Dr. Hammond, reviewed Elijah's file, the file Loretta had closed, and said the word that was, in 1990, the administrative equivalent of a death sentence for a black boy in an underfunded school. Transfer. Transfer meant reassignment to an alternative school. Alternative school meant a building on the south side with metal detectors and teachers who had given up and students who had been given up on. It meant Elijah would be removed from Bowen Elementary, removed from Loretta's classroom, removed from the library he had organized and the biscuits on his desk, and the one adult in his life who had looked at his face instead of his file. Transfer meant the end of the channel. It meant the river going back to flooding. Loretta went to Dr. Hammond's office. She closed the door. Nobody knows exactly what she said. Dr. Hammond retired in 1994 and never discussed it. But when she came out, the transfer was canceled. Elijah stayed at Bowen. He stayed in her class. He finished 4th grade with a B average, the highest grades he had ever received. And in June 1990, on the last day of school, Loretta held Elijah's face in both hands, chalk dust fingers, cocoa butter palms, and said, "Elijah Cobb, you are going to be somebody. Do you hear me? You are going to build things. And when you build them, I want you to build them strong. Do you understand?" Elijah nodded. He didn't cry. He was 9. 9-year-old boys from Bowen homes didn't cry. But something behind his sternum shifted. A small internal rearrangement, a beam being placed, a foundation being set. And that foundation held. Through middle school, through high school, through a construction apprenticeship at 19, through a contractor's license at 23, through a small business loan at 27, through 43 employees and $6 million a year and a 5-bedroom house in Alpharetta,
Through all of it, that foundation held. Because a woman had held his face and told him he was going to be somebody, and he had believed her. And belief, when it is planted by the right hands at the right time, is the strongest building material in the world. Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected.
Loretta Price retired from teaching in 2006 after 38 years. She was 63. She had a pension, $2,100 a month from the Georgia Teachers Retirement System, which was enough to live on if living meant a small apartment, a small car, and small expectations. Her husband, Raymond, had died in 2001. Heart attack, sudden, in the driveway of their home in Decatur while carrying groceries. One bag of groceries on the ground, oranges rolling into the grass, and Raymond face down on the concrete. Loretta found him. She picked up the oranges before she called 911 because her body did familiar things when her mind couldn't do the unfamiliar thing. And picking up oranges was familiar, and calling an ambulance for her husband of 34 years was not. She had 2 children. Sandra, 45, lived in Phoenix and called on birthdays. Marcus, 42, lived in Houston and called less than that. They were not bad children in the way that some children are bad. They were absent children, the kind who love their mother in theory and neglect her in practice, who send gift cards on Mother's Day and feel the obligation discharged. Sandra invited Loretta to Phoenix once, in 2014. Loretta flew there, her first flight, and stayed for 4 days, and Sandra worked 3 of them, and Loretta sat in a guest room with white walls and no photographs, and understood, with the quiet comprehension of a woman who had raised 2,000 other people's children, that her own children had built their lives with doors that didn't include a room for her. But what Elijah didn't know yet was that Loretta's life had been quietly falling apart. In 2017, Loretta was diagnosed with macular degeneration. Her vision narrowed, not blindness, but a closing, a slow reduction of the world to a smaller and smaller window. She couldn't drive after 2018. She couldn't read after 2019. Not books, not mail, not the fine print on medical bills that arrived with the regularity and the cruelty of a system designed for people who could see the numbers. She moved from the house in Decatur. She couldn't maintain it alone, couldn't navigate the stairs, couldn't see the stove well enough to cook safely, to a 1-bedroom apartment on Lawrenceville Highway in an unincorporated part of Gwinnett County, where the rent was $780 and the nearest grocery store was a 1.5-mile walk and the nearest bus stop was 6 blocks east. The pension covered rent and utilities. It did not cover food, medication, and the copays for the ophthalmologist who monitored her degeneration with the clinical detachment of a man who had delivered this diagnosis 1,000 times and had long ago stopped seeing the patient behind the chart. Loretta needed money. She couldn't work a traditional job. Her vision prevented it. She couldn't drive for rideshare. She couldn't stock shelves or wait tables or clean houses or do any of the things that women her age do when the pension doesn't stretch and the children don't send, and the world assumes that old age is a problem that solves itself. So she baked pies. Sweet potato pies, from a recipe her mother had taught her in 1958 in a kitchen in Macon, Georgia, where the oven ran hot on the left side, and the trick was to rotate the pan every 15 minutes so the crust browned evenly. Loretta could make the recipe blind, and she was nearly blind, and she nearly did. She made them by feel. She measured by hand. A handful of sugar, a palm of cinnamon, a pinch of nutmeg. She pressed the crust with her fingers, reading the dough's thickness the way she used to read children's faces, through touch, through attention, through the accumulated knowledge of 60 years of putting her hands on things and understanding what they needed. She set up a folding table between the gas station and the tire shop on Lawrenceville Highway. She put 3 pies in a cooler, all she could carry on the bus with her walker. She taped a cardboard sign to the table that said, "Sweet potato pie, $8, in letters large enough for her to see and large enough for drivers to read at 35 miles per hour. She sat in a plastic chair that she carried folded under one arm, and she waited. Some days she sold 3 pies. Some days she sold 1. Some days she sold none and carried the pies home and ate them herself for dinner, because pie was food and food was food, and pride was something Loretta had filed away long ago in the same drawer where she'd put Elijah's behavior file. Closed. Finished. Irrelevant. She needed $300 a month beyond her pension. The pies, on a good month, made $280. On a bad month, $160. The gap was filled with skipped meals, generic medications, and the particular grinding arithmetic of old age in America, where a woman who spent 38 years teaching children to read cannot afford to see the doctor who might save what's left of her sight. And just when Loretta thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. In September 2023, the tire shop owner told Loretta she had to move her table. The landlord who owned the strip where the tire shop sat had complained about unauthorized vendors on the property. Loretta moved the table 10 feet to the right, onto the public sidewalk, technically off the private property, technically legal, technically within her rights as a citizen of a country she had served for 38 years by teaching its children how to read and count and think. The tire shop owner shrugged. The gas station didn't care. The landlord sent a letter anyway. Loretta sat at her table the next morning. She couldn't read the letter. Her vision wouldn't let her. So she folded it and put it in her purse and sold 2 pies and went home and asked the neighbor's teenage son to read it to her. The letter said she had 10 days to vacate or face legal action. Loretta sat in her apartment and held the letter she couldn't read and thought about 38 years of teaching and $2,100 a month and 2 children who didn't call and a folding table that was the only thing between her and nothing. And she didn't cry because Loretta Price had never cried in front of anyone, and she wasn't going to start with an empty apartment. She went back the next morning. She set up the table. She put out 3 pies. She sat in her plastic chair. And at 7:42 a.m., Elijah Cobb drove past in his Mercedes, the way he had driven past for 361 days. And for the first time, something made him turn his head. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. He didn't recognize her. Not immediately. What he recognized was the pies. Sweet potato pies in a cooler. The smell. He caught it through his open window, a ghost of cinnamon and nutmeg that traveled across 2 lanes of traffic and 34 years and landed in the exact place in his memory where Loretta Price had put a biscuit on his desk every morning in 4th grade. The smell stopped him. Not his brain, his body. His foot moved from the gas to the brake the way Harold Green's hand had moved to the record button, without permission, without thought, obeying a signal older than reason. He pulled over. He got out. He walked to the table. The old woman was sitting in a plastic chair. She was small, smaller than he remembered, but he didn't know he was remembering. She wore thick glasses. Her hair was silver, in 2 puffs above her ears. She wore a cardigan, blue, not red, because red was for fire engines and stop signs. She looked up at him, but her eyes didn't focus the way eyes are supposed to focus. They settled on his general shape without sharpening on his specific face. "How much for a pie?" Elijah asked. $8, Loretta said. Her voice was the same. 34 years and her voice was the same. The precise, warm, slightly stern voice that had said, "Sit up straight and let me see your face," to a 9-year-old boy in a classroom with water-stained ceiling tiles. Elijah's hands went still at his sides. His chest expanded with a breath that caught halfway and wouldn't release. He said, "Mrs. Price?" Loretta tilted her head. She squinted. She leaned forward. She could see his shape. Tall, broad, dark. But the details were behind the fog. "Do I know you?" she said. Elijah knelt down. He knelt the way Steve Harvey knelt, the way men kneel when the moment is too large to meet standing up. He brought his face close to hers, close enough for her narrowed vision to find him. "Mrs. Price, it's Elijah. Elijah Cobb, 4th grade. Bowen Elementary, 1990. Loretta's hand flew to her mouth. Her glasses fogged instantly. The heat of her breath against the cold December air, the same physics that governs every cry, every gasp, every moment when the body expels something too warm for the atmosphere to hold. She said, "The library boy." Elijah nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat had closed around something that had been lodged there for 34 years. A biscuit, a napkin, a hand on his face, a voice saying,
You are going to be somebody. He took her hand. Her fingers were still strong. She still kneaded dough. She still pressed crust. She still held things. But the skin was thinner now, papery, and you could feel the bones underneath, the infrastructure of a woman who had spent a lifetime holding other people up. I drove past you, Elijah said. His voice was wrecked. I drove past you every day for a year. I saw you and I didn't stop. Loretta squeezed his hand. She said, You stopped today. It's not enough. Baby, it's enough.
You're here. That's enough. But what Elijah was about to discover would change everything. He bought all 3 pies. He put them in his car. He came back. He sat in the plastic chair beside Loretta's table, and he asked her what had happened. How the teacher who had saved his life was selling pies on a highway for $8. Loretta told him. She told him about Raymond and the oranges and the macular degeneration, and Sandra in Phoenix and Marcus in Houston, and the pension that didn't stretch, and the landlord's letter she couldn't read. She told it without self-pity, without bitterness, with the matter-of-fact cadence of a woman who had spent 38 years solving problems, and had simply run out of solutions for her own. Elijah listened. He listened the way a builder listens to a structure assessment, noting load points, stress fractures, areas of failure. And then he did what builders do. He built. He called Sharon from the parking lot. He said, I found Mrs. Price. Sharon said, Who is Mrs. Price? And Elijah realized, with a shame that tasted like metal in his mouth, that he had never told his wife about the woman who had saved his life. He had told Sharon about Bowen Homes, about Denise, about Dorothy, about the construction apprenticeship, but he had never mentioned the 4th-grade teacher who had put a biscuit on his desk every morning and stopped his transfer and held his face and told him he was going to be somebody. He had built his entire story without including the person who had laid the foundation. He said, She's the reason I'm standing, Sharon, and she's sitting on a highway selling pies for $8. Sharon said, Bring her home. Elijah brought Loretta home. Not to the 5-bedroom house in Alpharetta, not yet. He brought her to dinner that evening. Sharon cooked, fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and Loretta sat at their dining table and ate, and the boys, Elijah Jr., 14, and Marcus, 11, sat across from her, and Elijah Jr. asked, Were you really my dad's teacher? Loretta said, I was, and he organized my entire library in 3 days. Elijah Jr. looked at his father. Dad, you've never organized anything in your life. The table laughed, all of them, together, the sound filling the dining room of a house that a 9-year-old boy from Bowen Homes had built because a woman in a cardigan had told him he could. But Elijah wasn't done. Over the next 2 weeks, Elijah did what he did best. He built. He called an ophthalmologist at Emory Eye Center and scheduled Loretta for an evaluation. The doctor said her macular degeneration was advanced, but manageable with injections that could stabilize her remaining vision. The injections cost $1,200 per session. Loretta's insurance covered 60%. Elijah covered the rest. He called Sandra in Phoenix. The call was short. Elijah said, Your mother is selling pies on the side of a highway because she can't afford groceries. I was her student 34 years ago and I'm the one who found her. You need to call her. Sandra was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I didn't know it was that bad. Elijah said, It's that bad because nobody asked. Sandra called Loretta that evening. They talked for an hour. It was the longest conversation they'd had in 6 years. He called Marcus in Houston. Marcus cried on the phone. He booked a flight to Atlanta the following weekend. Elijah hired a lawyer. The lawyer contacted the landlord about the letter threatening legal action against a legally positioned sidewalk vendor. The landlord withdrew the complaint. The folding table stayed. But Elijah did more than fix the immediate problems. He looked at the structure, the way he looked at every structure, and he saw that the foundation needed rebuilding, not patching. Loretta's apartment was too expensive, too far from services, too isolated for a woman with failing vision. Her pension was too small. Her children were too far. The pies were not a business. They were a tourniquet. He found a senior living community in Lawrenceville, a clean, well-managed facility with a dining hall, an on-site nurse, and a rent that was covered entirely by Loretta's pension.
plus a supplement from a program Elijah's lawyer identified through the Georgia Department of Human Services. Loretta moved in January 2024. She had a room with a window that faced east. She specifically asked for east because the morning light was the light she could still see best, and she wanted to start every day inside something bright. She brought the folding table. She set it up in the community's common room every Saturday morning and sold pies to residents and staff. $8. The pies sold out every week.
The recipe hadn't changed since 1958. A handful of sugar, a palm of cinnamon, a pinch of nutmeg, a rotation every 15 minutes because the oven runs hot on the left side. She couldn't see the crust anymore, but she could feel it. And feel, Loretta had learned, was more reliable than sight. Sight can be fooled. Feel cannot. Elijah's son Marcus, the 11-year-old, started visiting Loretta on Saturdays. He sat in the common room and ate pie and listened to Loretta tell stories about Bowen Elementary, about the library with 12 books, about the boy who organized them by color and then by the Dewey Decimal System in 3 days. Marcus went home one Saturday and said, "Dad, Mrs. Price says you were the loudest kid she ever taught." Elijah said, "She's probably right." Marcus said, "She also said you were the best." Elijah looked at his son. 11 years old, the same age Elijah had been when the foundation was being set. He said, "Marcus, I wasn't the best at anything. I was hungry and loud, and I had a file full of suspensions. Mrs. Price just saw something in me that nobody else was looking for. And then she fed me breakfast so I could sit still long enough to find it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, can I bring her oranges? She told me she likes oranges, but she hasn't had one in a while because they're hard to peel when you can't see good." Elijah's chest did the thing it had done at the folding table, expanded with a breath that caught halfway. He said, "Yeah, buddy, bring her oranges." Marcus brought oranges every Saturday after that. He peeled them for her. He sat in the common room and peeled oranges and ate pie and listened to a woman who had spent 38 years feeding other people's children tell him about a time when the world was harder and the rooms were colder, and the only thing standing between a hungry boy and an alternative school was a teacher who closed his file and opened her hands. Today, Elijah Cobb is 45 years old. He still drives Lawrenceville Highway every morning. The folding table is gone. Loretta doesn't need it anymore. But the spot between the gas station and the tire shop is still there, and Elijah slows down every time he passes it. Not because something is there, because something was there. And because he drove past it for 361 days without stopping. And that fact sits inside him like a nail that was never fully driven, the head still protruding, catching on everything that passes. Loretta Price is 81 years old. Her vision has stabilized. The injections are working. She can see faces again, not crisply, but enough, the way you see a photograph through a window with rain on it. Sandra calls every week now. Marcus flew in for Loretta's 81st birthday. They both came. Sandra from Phoenix, Marcus from Houston. And they sat in the common room eating pie with their mother and an 11-year-old boy named Marcus, who had the same name as one of them, and who peeled oranges with the careful attention of a child who has been taught, by a story about a biscuit on a desk, that small acts of feeding are never small. Elijah established the Loretta Price Foundation in February 2024. It provides supplemental income, medical support, and housing assistance for retired teachers in Georgia whose pensions fall below the poverty line, which, according to the data Elijah's accountant pulled, is 23% of all retired public school teachers in the state. The foundation's first act was to commission a study of food insecurity among retired educators. The findings were devastating. Elijah presented them at a state education conference. He stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom, pressed khakis, colored shirt, nail gun scar on his forearm, and said, "The woman who taught me to read is 81 years old. She was selling pies on the side of a highway for $8 because her pension doesn't cover groceries. She fed me breakfast every morning for a year when I was 9 years old, and 34 years later, the richest country on earth couldn't feed her." The room was silent. Then it was not. On the wall of the Foundation's office in Lawrenceville, in a simple frame, is a piece of masking tape. On the tape, in the handwriting of a 9-year-old boy, is a Dewey Decimal number, 372.4, the classification for elementary education. Elijah wrote it in 1990 and taped it to the spine of a donated book in Loretta Price's classroom library. Loretta kept the book. She kept all 12 books. They are on a shelf in her room at the senior living community, still organized, still labeled, still carrying the fingerprints of a boy who needed a system to put his energy into, and a woman who gave him one. A man drove past a woman selling pies for 361 days. He saw her every morning. He never stopped. And when he finally stopped, when the smell of cinnamon traveled across 2 lanes in 34 years and caught him in the part of his memory where breakfast and safety lived, he found the woman who had built him on her knees, selling $8 pies to survive. That is not a story about charity. That is a story about the distance between the people who build us and the lives we build without them. We drive past our foundations every day. We pass them at 35 miles per hour, and we don't stop because stopping would mean slowing down, and slowing down would mean seeing, and seeing would mean owing, and owing is the one debt that success cannot write a check for. You have to stop the car. You have to get out. You have to kneel down and say the name. That's the end of today's story, but the lessons last forever. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and tell us in the comments, which character reminded you of someone in your own life? See you soon.